Thanks to everyone for joining us. I think this will be a very interesting discussion, just even based on the pre-discussions that we've had. And I think Clay was just saying we could talk about this topic for many, many hours. We could probably do a full day on it. So we'll try and get to the interesting stuff as quickly as possible and hopefully get people thinking about things, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. Just to start out as kind of like some level setting stuff, I think there have been all these discussions about sort of the role of AI and, more broadly, the tech industry and how it impacts democracy today. And there is an argument going around that tech in the last few years has actually been almost anti-democratic and has been part of the reason why we're in this world that we're living in today, where democracy is under threat, if it still exists at all. And I fear that kind of thinking, and that sort of idea that tech is inherently anti-democratic. And in fact, I think we really need to be thinking about where tech and democracy connect to each other in very important ways. And I think that you can't think about those things as separate things. I think technology and democracy are deeply, deeply intertwined, and I think that is true of AI technology as well. I think that one of the things that we're discovering right now is that when any sort of technology is controllable, whether it's by billionaires or companies or the government, and right now there's an argument that those three things are the same, or probably worse. I was going to say for better or for worse, but for worse. And that is where the problems come in, but that when technology is actually empowering and is empowering for the users, then it becomes essential to democracy. I was going to quote Audrey Tang, who I think everybody should know, the former digital minister of Taiwan, who's always very, very thoughtful on this stuff, made a comment years ago when I saw her speak at a conference saying that the internet and democracy are not two things. They are one and the same. In Taiwan specifically, she was talking about the timing of when the internet and democracy arrived in Taiwan and how they're now sort of viewed as the same thing. And I think that's true of AI as well. I think used properly, it is a very empowering tool for democracy, but used poorly or in control or under the pursuits of, again, sort of billionaires, companies, or governments, that it could be very problematic. So figuring out that balance, I think, is really, really important. And that's what I'm hopeful we will talk about today. We've already had an introduction to who all the panelists are. I'm going to start with a question for each of them to give them a chance to kind of give their view on these things, some of which may disagree with what I just said, which is fine. And then we'll go into a bigger discussion. I'm going to start in the middle with Saffron. When we were discussing sort of things to talk about, you sent over a piece that you had written a few months ago for Noema magazine, which was one of the most fascinating things I've read in a long time, and really got me thinking, and I've been telling people about it. So I wanted to start out by asking you about it. The sort of premise you had in that article was that, as people are thinking about AI and how it's going to impact people, there's been a lot of discussion about the sort of after effects. Oh, if AI destroys everybody's job, we're going to need something like UBI, Universal Basic Income, to go out there. And you make a very interesting argument in that article that that's maybe the wrong way to think about it, that is a redistribution effort that comes after the problems have come about. But what if we were thinking about a pre-distribution, is the phrase you use, to sort of give people more access to the technology themselves at the beginning. So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit in terms of how you think that sort of framing impacts the question of where AI and liberal democracy intersect.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. So yeah, in the piece, I basically talk about how a lot of the kind of like initial ideas that people are throwing around for how we cope with AI's potential impact on the economy or on labor markets, kind of don't think about this question of power or don't really see it as an opportunity to actually benefit more people. So a lot of the ways that people, okay, I think a lot of the sort of like tech leaders maybe throw around the idea of UBI, or there's this idea of the windfall clause, which is basically a proposed legal opt-in legal mechanism to have, you know, say an AI company, once it gets to a certain size, and the figures that they throw around are like 1% of world GDP or something, which is already insane, and like bigger than the biggest monopolies we've seen in the past. Once the sort of like companies get to a kind of threshold like that, then they will sort of like donate a certain proportion of their profits to charity in some way to sort of like help out the rest of the world, I guess. And so it's these kinds of proposals, and I see UBI as similar, at least in the way that people conceive of them right now. They're sort of like, okay, well, I guess everyone will just be sort of like a welfare state dependent. And this is really problematic for a lot of reasons. What are the incentives of the companies to sort of like continue honoring that contract if it's even necessary to? And what does this do to people's kind of role in society as citizens, as feeling like they can contribute, and also sort of like having any say in their material environment? Like, I think being part of our economy and making decisions that are relevant to it are sort of ways that people kind of like vote in a sense on like what they want to see in the world, and making decisions about like in business basically. So I find those approaches very disempowering, and I think the thing that I was proposing, me and my co-author were proposing, was to think about how we can make sure that earlier people have access to the human sort of educational and like the human capital. So like having the educational access to these things, like understanding AI literacy, the financial capital to access AI, and also on a more collective or city or government scale, thinking about like financial instruments to share the wealth of AI with citizens and having more sort of like cooperative ownership arrangements. I think one thing here is that a lot of problems right now, at least in sort of Western countries like this one's, a lot of it, I see a lot of problems around kind of like scarcity and inequality. And I think technological revolutions can, depending on how they play out, they can really exacerbate that, but they can also be a way to tip the playing field and kind of like adjust the direction that society is going in. And I do think that like AI is potentially a way of kind of like sticking a lever in the current situation and kind of trying to like move things a little bit, just in terms of where power is going to lie in the future. So kind of thinking about these mechanisms and thinking about these ways we can get ahead of that might hopefully lead to better outcomes.
Great. For the people in the back, there are a few seats available. There's like one over here and a few in the front. I know there's more people coming in, so search around for seats so you don't have to stand for the whole time. Clay, I'm going to go to you next. I think there's a theme that is going to come up a lot in this discussion, certainly came up a lot in our sort of planning discussion, which is that, again, sort of the technology can be used for good or bad, or could create good or bad situations. And one of the things that you raised is sort of a fear that AI is going to guide people into smaller and smaller filter bubbles. And then we're all sort of going to end up in our own little worlds with the AI telling us that we're always right, and whatever we think must be true, because the AI has this habit often of, as is commonly referred to, as glazing people. I know that you've been thinking a little bit like, well, what do we do about that? So as an initial provocation, what is your thinking of how do you combat that world where everybody lives in their own sort of bubble, which I think is something that people are very concerned about as it then relates more broadly to, democracy.
Yeah, I have less on what we do about that than characterizing the problem right now, unfortunately. But the Enlightenment conception of human beings as these rational, optimizing truth seekers starts to take body blow after body blow. In the second half of the 20th century, as you get psychology, sociology, economics constantly demonstrating that we are emotional, satisficing, motivated research. We are, as a species, given to believing things that affirm our viewpoints more than we believe things that contradict our viewpoints without regard to factual accuracy. And that delivers a body blow to democracy. It's no longer this kind of Hayekian aggregation of well thought through policy preferences by highly engaged individuals. It's a way of saying to politicians, you do it. Like, I don't want to get in a fight over allocation of scarce resources, but somebody's got to be on my side, so I say it to you, right? And the system, if it works, keeps politics from sliding into either authoritarianism or anarchy, which is to say sliding into the Scylla and Charybdis of the state having too much power, the state having too little power. So what happens when you drop AI in the middle of that? The fateful choice with AI, with the current generation of generative AI tools since roughly end of 2022, was to do the last 10% tweak on the language model. So it's what's something called reinforcement learning through human feedback. You show people, here's 20 different answers, what do you like better? Do you like this one better? Do you like that one better? Over and over and over and over and over and over at incredible scale, gradually tune the tools to give answers that people like. And if we were rational, optimizing truth seekers, that would have led these tools towards more factual accuracy and more saying, I don't know the answer, or there are competing answers. But because we're not those people, we get glazing and sycophancy instead. Right. So what you've got with AI currently is this way of building your own hermetically sealed filter bubble. What's coming is AI for groups. And this is the common Silicon Valley. So my work is in social media, and I've seen over and over Silicon Valley will ship a tool optimized for individuals, underestimate the effects when groups start using it, and then those effects reveal themselves in content. So AI right now is this thing I use behind my back, and then I say, lo and behold, I ask ChatGPT or whatever, here's the answer. But with retrieval augmented generation, which is a way of saying stick to these documents, and with better sharing models coming out with these tools and larger context windows, more kind of availability of context, we're going to go from AI as a personalization tool to AI as a socialization tool. We can have an AI that knows that it's only talking to members of the Girl Scouts of America or the Democratic Socialists of America or the Nazi Party of America. And the choice, and this is where you get this, I think, fork in the road. One way you could build those tools, and this is actually relevant to some of what Saffron said with Anthropic. One way you could build these tools is to push them in the direction of pluralism. When it sees members of a group having different opinions, to surface and try and validate those opinions and say, you ought to either debate this, or you should decide that you can tolerate a range of views within your group. But another way to do it is just to hide the fact that you disagree. And for the AI to start producing language that papers over or masks places where there's internal agreement among the group because you'd be optimizing for emotional cohesion rather than for intellectual cohesion. Given the market-driven incentives of current AI companies, and most especially OpenAI, who has in less than 1,000 days become one of the 10 most trafficked websites in the world, because it tells people what they want to hear. I mean, even Wikipedia doesn't do that. But boy, if you want to be told you're right, ChatGPT is like that's your go-to. The market incentives for OpenAI are almost entirely directed towards telling groups what they want to hear. And I start from an pluralistic place, but I think that's bad for democracy. I think you need outside forces. I think you need nonprofits and ideally government to care about the health of democracy, where we're going to have that would push towards group AI at least having the opportunity to serve pluralistic disagreement as opposed to mass.
I was going to say, one thing I've noticed about some of the newer models is they're not as quick to glaze.
Right.
And I had a very interesting experience, but I'll talk about very quickly before going on to the next question, which is, so it's basically telling you flattery, telling you what you wanted to hear. Say like whatever you put in, like, oh, that was brilliant. You are the smartest, most thoughtful. That was a great question. I use various AI tools as an editor. I write everything first, and then I ask it for an opinion. And for a while, it was sort of like, "Oh, this is a really thoughtful piece." And then when Claude 4 came out, the first time I asked it, I wrote this whole piece, and it said to me, "You go way too deep into the legal weeds." And I have it actually trained on a bunch of stuff that I write, so it knows that it's writing for my audience. And I said back to it, like, that's what I do, right? Like going deep into legal weeds, that's me. And it said, "I know you go," the response was, I took a screenshot of it, it was so great. It was, "I know you go deep I know you go deep into the legal weeds all the time, but this time when you do it, it hides how fucking crazy this story really is." And I was like, wow, okay, it's got an attitude now.
But the counter to that story, I think, is ChatGPT 5 just launched,
yes,
and was much less sycophantic and
awesome.
Users revolted so badly
that they
shut down. It was like we are 72 hours ago that we're bringing it back.
Yeah,
because so many people lost their friends.
Yes,
they lost their flattering mirror. Like people are already committed to glazing as a core feature.
Yes.
You might you can't put yourself forward as the average user.
That is fair. All right. We're all gonna die.
Yeah, well, yes. Each of us individually, let's just hope it doesn't all happen at the same time.
So, Puja, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. When we were discussing sort of what we wanted to talk about, I thought you actually had a really interesting provocation, in part pushing back on some of the stuff that I've been talking about. You know, I've focused a lot on sort of user choice and agency and things like that. And you suggested that, you know, that is insufficient and won't be enough, and actually is subject to capture and could lead to bad results if you sort of over-index on that. So I wanted to, give you a chance to sort of explain your position, sort of where you think we need to be thinking about these things.
Well, I'm all for optimizing agency. I think the word you said was control. And so there's a parallel experiment going on with AI right now, right? And that's crypto and cryptocurrencies, and they're converging. And if you look at what happened with like cryptocurrency protocols, right, it was all about the self-sovereign individual and user control over your wallet, and all these systems were just built around protecting the individual's control over their wallet. Now, how has that experiment actually played out, right? We have a whole economy living on Twitter on an attention auction, rotating between shit coins and meme coins in a zero-sum game, right? And that actually has an enhanced productive capacity. And the innovation has actually really just helped, let's be clear, scammers and fascists get rich, right? And poor people get poor. And so, the emphasis on user control, control is one side of the equation of power. My theory of power is there's also information. And we have to acknowledge the information environments, especially when we are all engaged essentially in a tacit attention auction on social media, right? And we're entering these balkanized epistemic environments. So bridging to these earlier comments from Clay and Saffron on groups and the importance of coalitions, like representing the coalitions and groups and communities to which we belong to is actually key for democratic governance. And if you kind of I'm going to simplify a little bit here about theory of democratic governance, but one way to look about it is that it's, democratic governance is there to provision shared, common, collective, and public goods, and markets are there to provision private goods. And, when our Constitution was formed, we had this theory of geographic representation where our information was generally geographically localized. And, our representatives could go to Washington and duke it out and find common shared public goods, right, through consensus. Now, because we are also online in essentially what are these tacit attention auctions and are balkanized, we need to find ways to represent our participation in different balkanized epistemic environments to find common goods and public goods across these divides. And so Clay was highlighting some experiments that Saffron has worked on, but there's also, another set of plurality of experiments, which Audrey Tong has been very pivotal in. One is Talk to the City, which allows, participants, for example, like in Tokyo in the gubernatorial election, recently participants and parties joined an online WhatsApp group and gave their input, and AI was used to, facilitate bridging statements. And then there was clusters of opinions, And then candidates were able to get a pulse on, okay, where are their consensus points and where are the cleavage? And if you want to highlight conflict, you can. If you want to highlight consensus and find common shared goods, you can. Talk to the City is one project out of the AI Objectives Institute. Engage California is a recent initiative that's building on the same principles after the wildfires to garner public input and find low-hanging fruit common ground. And I think this is really important. You know, earlier I was talking to Francis Fukuyama, and there seems to be this, this general sense that there is this compromise between participation and speed. And actually, we can leverage these technology tools to, actually have both at the same time and make democratic participation have the speed and, funness of markets, but also the legitimacy and participation of democratic governments.
Just very quickly, there's still people in the back and there's still a few seats in the front if anyone wants to. Doing my job as room monitor as well as moderator on the panel. I think all of these discussions sort of keep coming back to some inherent tensions, right? So we're talking about things around, pluralism and consensus and, agency, but also sort of, finding common ground among groups. And so I'm sort of curious across the board for all three of you, like, how do we balance those things? Because the thing that I struggle with is that a lot of this is really nice and interesting in theory. And then when you have sort of bad actors come in and say, well, wait, we can exploit that to our own advantage, then suddenly, they can use the same language of pluralism and, and consensus, but to very anti-democratic ends. And so how do we think about those things beyond just saying like, oh, these are, good platitudes to think about and good things to go towards, but how do we actually implement them in a way that is actually good?
Can I just clarify when you say bad actors coming in and exploring these things, like what are you thinking of?
I mean, I'm thinking of a lot of different things because it could be used in all different things, right? So in all different ways. So in some sense, you can think of it just as in, individuals or groups using the technology in ways to distort a conversation or a discussion, or you could think about it in terms of those who have control over those platforms in some sense or another, using it to try and achieve their own interests, right? So in the social media context, it's a little different in the AI context, but in the social media context, the sort of example is like Elon Musk taking over X for his own political, or Twitter turning into X for his own political interests. When we're talking about these things in terms of like, how do you set up AI tools to do this? Is there a risk that those in charge of it start twisting it to their own interests as opposed to the interests of the public at large? Or have they already done so?
I mean, that risk is permanent. There's no political system that it has a sort of set it to forget it feature of representing the broadest polity. But pick up on something Puja was saying about groups. A lot of these conversations start about technology and end up saying the United States needs a parliamentary system. There's this aggregation issue of there is no coherent policy that tells you both what our position should be on chip exports to China and legalization of marijuana. There isn't a way that those things automatically align. So you end up needing to aggregate opinions into policy preferences that include the inevitable trade-offs. In parliamentary systems, the disappointment of the trade-offs comes after people are elected. In the United States, it comes before, because you're forced to pick a party that you know in advance won't represent you. Whereas in a parliamentary system, you go, I'm going to vote for the Greens. The Greens are going to make the government much more environmentally friendly. And then the Greens have to go into a coalition with other people. And the trade-offs come after you've done your bit. And so you feel a little bit better than you do in the U.S. context. But what's really interesting now is this thing Peter was pointing to, which is that groups can assemble around issues, and it can be much more dynamic. I thought the thing you said about there isn't a big trade-off between participation and speed anymore, like that's one of the legacies of social media. One thing we could do is disaggregate policy preferences and let people know, have people let each other know in close to real time where their going. I mean, it's been clear that legalization of marijuana has been a winning issue in the United States for decades, but because the parties were stuck, it was very difficult to move that particular issue. But if you start to unbundle the issues a little bit, because you can aggregate groups of humans fast with larger scale, you might be able to rethink what it takes to aggregate policy preferences in a way that the government responds.
I'll give a little different take on this, on the bad actors. So like, this is policing the boundary between cooperation and collusion, right, is a very tricky question. And, when we talk, so my perspective of who's a bad actor is kind of like, oh, are they aligned with me? And like, you kind of look at these different balkanized epistemic environments and social media platforms, whether it's Musk or Zuckerberg, and what you're seeing is actually kind of limitations to growth because they have so much influence, right? And so one way for these platforms to actually overcome those limitations of growth and lean into like what has been driving the economies of scale, scope, and network effects is to actually incorporate the inputs of participants. I don't like saying the word user. I prefer participant. Participants to these systems, and not just as individual users, but again, like enabling the surfacing of opinions, right, through things like Polis or through things like Talk to the City, or enabling the surfacing of clusters of groups to enable a prioritization of not just say like product features that serve like more common goods, but also like how to regulate these as social media entities and even introduce nested forms of regulation within communities. And that would actually expand, the scope and reach of these platforms while diminishing, the influence of like the singular CEO, right? And actually approach what I call this paradox of decentralized monopolies.
So,
right?
Yeah. So just to respond to that, I think you're right. My question, and to push you a little further, is how do you make that a reality, right? So, like Polis has been out for a decade, right?
Yeah.
Taiwan, which was based on it, that's almost a decade at this point, maybe.
Types.
Yeah.
Right.
But we haven't seen those tools used as widely. There are more examples, and you mentioned a few of them earlier. But it's one thing to see these tools in action, and then but actually getting people to embrace them when the incentive for most people in power right now is not to. So how do you get past that?
Well, I'm just saying, if I'm the CEO of like Facebook, I'm facing a trade-off between my influence and my natural reach of the platform.
Is that true? Does Mark Zuckerberg think that right now?
Well, I mean, they should, because there is this balkanization, right? And there's this epistemic, people aren't True Social, people aren't X, right? And that actually does limit the conversation. Like I'm on Substack and not here, and the ability for cross collaboration, ideas generation, right? And so if you want to actually expand the reach, right, then expanding the class of influence is necessary, right? Otherwise, you just achieve these, you just hit these ceilings, right?
Saffron, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So I think one thing, I think of the thing that the issue you're pointing to with, you're saying like there's a trade-off between individual agency and sort of these like want these sort of like social communities or trying to do things in a more pluralistic community way. And pointing to X as an example of that. I think X is more I would see it more as like just there's really, really, really rich people now who can buy like whole social media platforms and lose money on them, and it's fine. And they also care more about like influence and attention necessarily than just accumulating money now. So I think like that's also part of why I wrote that piece on sharing AI's future wealth, because I do feel like so many things come back to like who has the money to do things and who doesn't, and how is money spread out over society. But then on the sort of individual agency versus social trade-off, I don't think there's as much of a trade-off as there is posed, because I think even these ideas of like making issues more granular, or being able to participate in in social media or on group chats or whatever in a more productive way. Like, people are already doing that. People want to be social. It is part of their agency to want to be social and to do that productively. And so making people feel like that is more effective is part of like augmenting individual agency. And yeah, so I feel like there's not as much of a tension. I think the real tension is your question of like, how do you even make these things powerful? Because people don't want to participate in like just another discussion of stuff, and everybody's really short on time. And so if you don't link the public input process or the discussion or whatever to some concrete legible output, then, you know, why are you asking for people's time in this? And so I think the question of connecting it to power is the important one. And I do feel like, you know, starting with government, democratic government, which has a mandate to represent the will of the people, is a good place to start. And so I think Engage California is really cool. All of these like, you know, actually a lot of kind of countries around the world have sort of adapted Polis, or the sort of Be Taiwan. My brain is blanking. That like software package basically to their own languages. Like in Brazil, there's a Portuguese equivalent of it, which is very, very cool. And I think it is. I don't know how you speed it up, and especially not here, really. But yeah, like I think I'm excited to see what happens with Engage California, because it's one of the biggest states and a good place to begin. Sorry.
No, I was just going to make sure in the audience, are people aware of Polis and Be Taiwan? Okay, so does someone want to give a quick summary of they're very interesting tools, and you should know about them if you're interested in this, but who wants to give the quick summary of?
Sure. I mean, so with Polis, you say you're have a group, you can seed some certain statements to get the conversation started. People respond up or down, and then they can add statements. And people start to respond up or down to those statements, and those statements that get more engagement rise to the top. But eventually what you start to get are clusters of groups, you know, based off of individuals. And then based off of those clusters of groups, you can actually leverage AI to form bridging statements that might help find common ground between them. And that becomes your low-hanging fruit opportunity. Something like Talk to the City does the same thing, except and takes the same information, but instead of, say, clustering individuals into tribes or groups, it clusters opinions. And so that surfaces like common ground faster. And so there are different variations, but essentially it's, you know, relying on user or participant input and feedback to iteratively find what are the, you know, common ground and tension points. And it's, you know, it's important because a lot of people are informationally correlated. So like something like one person, one vote, right, doesn't necessarily, it doesn't capture this, you know, nuance and variation. So, yeah.
And just really quickly, like Polis is open source software, and it's actually, though has gotten very distant from that, was the original basis of what became Community Notes on X. So if people are familiar with Community Notes and sort of how it tries to hit a point of consensus, that's a sort of very simple illustration of what Polis can do. So if you have some experience with that, you might.
Yeah, and yeah, just to add to that, it's really interesting because they don't try and surface opinion groups from like looking at your demographics or where you're from or anything like that. They look at how when people join this a given Polis conversation, you can vote on all the previous statements or any subset of them, and you can also add your own. And so it basically tries to sort of like cluster people into opinion, basically embeds your opinions and sort of like clusters people into opinion groups. So it surfaces like new coalitions or new like axes of alignment that you wouldn't necessarily if you're just like, well, I'm going to define people. I'm going to say, you know, okay, what age are you, a race are you or something? It's much more about what you believe. And then the bridging statements are kind of come up from that, where it's like, okay, here are the sort of like bottom up sort of natural opinion groups for this particular issue, just speaking to the like issue specific coalition thing here, what are the statements that are popular across groups? So there might be one group that really, really hates this issue, but they're a minority. So there's like a tyranny of the majority thing, where, you know, it directly affects them, but they're such a small group that everybody kind of runs roughshod over them. And the way that Polis sort of guards against this is like across the natural opinion groups for the specific issue, what are the statements that are have relatively high average agreement across all of them to sort of like mitigate this effect. So I think just like the way that they try to use like the way that they calculate these things is really interesting in terms of like what kinds of agreements they're able to surface. And I started a nonprofit a few years ago called the Collective Intelligence Project, and we work on a bunch of like AI and democracy projects, and we use Polis for a lot of them and have worked with Audrey. And so, for example, we use this to just in terms of kind of connecting it to power. Like the thing that we would do is we would find like a tech company or an organization making decisions about AI that might be influential. So for example, we went to OpenAI and we were like, okay, how are you deciding how to evaluate your models? Like, what are the evaluations that you're running on them? And do you have any public input on them? No. So we kind of ran a process to get more public input into that, because what engineers think might be important risks to evaluate for are not necessarily what like more groups of people would think are important risks to evaluate for. And then similarly with Anthropic, did one where through Polis, we had like a random sample of 1,000 Americans choose the rules of behavior for an AI model, and kind of we ran the public input process. Anthropic trained the model and kind of compared it against the baseline, and it was as performant but less biased along a bunch of social bias dimensions like age bias, disability bias, gender bias, all of these things. Than the baseline model where the engineers had kind of like picked the rules. So I think like the way that we kind of approach using Polis is like pick a stakeholder that has an important decision to make that like people would care about, and kind of convince them to use Polis to like impact this decision basically, or use some kind of tooling like this. But yeah, these are sort of like one-off, like piece by piece things. It's not like a ongoing infrastructure, and the thing that I would like to see is more of that.
I think that the two sort of early examples, success cases, which I want to highlight here since this is a policy-oriented group, in Taiwan was actually around two very controversial issues, same-sex marriage and Uber regulation. So the Constitutional Court in Taiwan ruled same-sex marriage was legal. There was a huge backlash against that and a public referendum against it, right? And so what Audrey did in Taiwan was run a Polis and find the coalitions, the divides, the common points. And what ended up happening was as a parallel process, there came these compromise points where rather than redefine marriage, which was controversial to traditionalists and conservatives, confer the rights that were important to gay couples, which is what they wanted, and create a special statutory exemption without calling it marriage, right? And then actually that's what ended up like being the compromise and becoming its like own statutory language. And so they achieved the objectives with compromise. And the same thing happened with Uber regulation on like how to figure out, okay, like, Uber's just going to come and they don't want to be regulated like a taxi company. They're claiming their platform, right? And so Polis was used to help find a compromise where they had to negotiate with taxi fleets. And that actually ended up being a form of like collective bargaining for taxi drivers who wouldn't otherwise have leverage on their own to negotiate better profit sharing through their taxi fleets and like certain other forms of like safety regulation. And so that was a way to quickly deal with new cultural and technological changes with legitimacy. And so I think as we grapple with cost disease and housing, healthcare, and education, these as just parallel processes can help policymakers and lawmakers find kind of common ground very quickly, and like, even language that's bridging language that doesn't trigger, right, groups, and help us move forward.
And I'll just add to the bridging language thing as a kind of natural experiment. A bunch of the American sort of letter writing sites that form, like, where should a group of us get together and write to archivers, people, what have you. Those algorithms are almost tuned to surface areas of maximum agreement, and you instantly sync anything where there was significant disagreement. So if you would suggest something that would create a debate in this group, and it would sync from the homepage within minutes, because the incentive of those platforms was to maximize good feeling, but not the kind of bridging language that Policy in Taiwan have meant. Politics is hard work, and it's you can shortcut it with emotions, and when platforms are optimizing for growth, they very often want to create the emotions that create cohesion, even if there are discussions that those groups ought to be having.
And correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember correctly, with Taiwan and those two issues in particular, the Parliament had agreed to sort of, I think there was some sort of pre-agreement that Parliament would abide by whatever was sort of the conclusion that came out of that system.
I'm not sure, actually. I don't think so.
I remember something to that effect, so maybe I'm wrong on the specifics. But that made me think about sort of, again, there are a few different elements here, one of which is the technology and sort of how that advances. And one is sort of like both the government acceptance of it and or regulatory positioning. And then there's the question of the social movements as well, right? And so in the examples that we've used with Taiwan, you sort of saw pieces of all three of those things, right? You had the sort of social movement that spoke up about these things. They had the technology in place so they could do stuff. And then you had a regulatory situation in which, whether or not they had sort of committed to it or not, they then sort of used that tool to actually do something with it. Do you need all three of those pieces in alignment to make this work? Or is there one of those areas or two of those areas that you can invest in that sort of drags the other ones along to make those things effective?
I mean, I don't know, but I mean, like, fundamentally, we're talking about communication technology, and you brought up community notes as an example. There are ways when and this actually, maybe this can like expand our conversation to how we think about the political economy of AI, and in particular, like centralized surveillance AI. To the extent that you have communities and groups, and faith and family groups are really important, right? That we haven't talked about them at all. And they're actually, I think, probably critical in this fight we are in today. When you're able to give groups some sense of autonomy, and even like leverage AI agents that represent their principal interests in an incentive compatible way, what you can do is enable like communities to figure out how to bridge effectively and communicate their shared interests and message with other groups for greater cooperation at a time when language in this attention auction we are in is being weaponized and balkanized, right? And so part of the problem, the collective action problem and common knowledge problem we face today is just figuring out how to communicate across many different groups, faith groups, family groups, when there is a shared common ground, and finding those right words, right? And I think that's fundamentally, how we use language, process language, and communicate with each other is fundamental to the political process. And just restoring that contextual integrity alone is very important for democratic integrity and legitimacy.
I wanted to actually slightly change the subject / bring up a couple more things that, and we can keep talking about what we've been talking about before, but I think because the title of this panel is AI and liberal democracy, I feel like we kind of see AI as a communication technology, but there's a lot more to both AI and liberal democracy than that, I think. So, I mean, one thing is slightly more broadly, AI is an information technology. And I think that I kind of mentioned this in our emails before, but you know, democracy has a lot of information processing and decision making, and sort of like democracy is kind of a collective information technology. AI is also an information technology. So changing how information is processed and who can understand what can have a really big impact. And I think, you know, attention is very scarce. And one of the things that I'm excited about in terms of AI and civic engagement is I think that people just don't have the time to engage with politics, really. Like, people read the news and like learn about, you know, high level national politics, but even then, I think people don't necessarily make particularly informed votes on the national level, and then a lot of things are actually determined at the local and state level. And like I last year, when I kind of had just joined Anthropic, leading up to the November elections, I did this experiment internally where I had Claude help people understand their ballots. Because in California, there's like 20 things on the ballot and they're all very niche issues. And people are like, I'm just going to see how there's like a voter guide from like the League of Pissed Off Voters, and people go to that. Yeah, and then people would just be like, I'm going to go to the League of Pissed Off Voters and just see how they want me to vote, and then I'll vote that way. And I think that's basically what do you call it, liquid democracy, where you're just like delegating your vote, which is not ideal. And so I basically got two groups of people internally. I got people internally to volunteer for this experiment where I had half of them use Claude and I put all of the sort of documents relevant to this particular ballot, all the legal documents and everything, and had them interact with Claude to understand what was going on. And then the other group I just gave them the list of documents and I was like, here you go. And you can also use Google. And, you know, the people who used Claude to sort of like understand the ballots, I mean, like I asked people beforehand also what were their main issues in terms of voting on these ballot measures, and it was time and overwhelm and detention and all of these things. And Claude seemed to be quite good at mitigating these issues and making people get to a better understanding of the ballots much faster with less time. I kind of had a survey to quiz them on their understanding of it afterwards. What was interesting to me actually is that they had a much better core understanding of the logic of the ballot, like what is this new piece of policy actually going to do? But they had like less understanding of the contextual details than people who used Google or just read the documents directly, right? Because when you read things directly or via Google, the answer's not directly given to you, but you're kind of picking up all of these contextual things as you're like looking for your answer. And so people learn slightly different things. And I think it's like really interesting and maybe a way to, maybe you can have AI agents that run around and pick up all the information for you. But I think it's like potentially a way to try and get at this sort of attention issue that we have with civic engagement, and sort of like need for expertise to decide on things. The two more things I'll quickly say. So the first thing was AI for civic engagement. The second thing is transparency and accountability. So you could have AIs kind of crawling the internet and trying to check for like discrepancies and, you know, what the government says it's doing versus what it's actually doing, something. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think we pay a lot of attention to the political process, but as I alluded to earlier, I think a lot of what affects people is kind of like state capacity and sort of like their local government and state government. And if they don't feel like those things are working for them, then they're probably going to be very disengaged at like those levels and above. And so I do think that, you know, using AI in government to make the paperwork of government less painful, to sort of like enable, very sort of cash-strapped departments to do more with less, and to deliver better services is actually quite important, I think, for people's like general belief that the system works for them, and they can live good lives. So yeah, those are just three things.
Pick up a little bit on the AI for civic engagement thing, because there's a really interesting moment now where, right now it's just talk, but the Trump administration is complaining about woke answers from AI and wants to intervene in the models with a low rank adaptation or retrieval augmented generation, any of the sort of menagerie of tools for affecting the output after it goes through the model. It's roughly analogous to the situation Baidu finds itself in China. China's Google, which is, it's biased the whole internet, so it has everything in there, and then it has to grab references, Tiananmen, on the way out and suppress it. And that's roughly what the Trump administration is proposing now. So for Americans of a certain age, there was a moment where The Guardian suddenly became an absolutely essential news source in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, because the national press became a nationalistic press, and there was not great information about essentially the worldwide movement that was targeting the United States. The Guardian were just better reporters on it because it wasn't in their backyard, and the Guardian's readership explodes after 9/11. We could start to see, particularly models in France, the UAE, and China, becoming better tools for civic engagement than models in the United States, if the current government intervenes in major commercial models.
So we get our own great firewall.
Well, it's weird. It's like Inside Out, where the stuff we're threatened by is the stuff that's inside the country. It's I don't exactly know how to describe it, but it's basically, if you, there's no such thing as unbiased from AI, but if you want to avoid the particular anti-woke bias of the current administration, you end up going to Mistral, or you end up going to QWEN or DeepSeek, or whatever G42 is building in the UAE. There are going to be a bunch of these sort of nationalistic, nationally supported foundation models, which ironically might be better tuned to American civic norms than if the American hosted companies are forced to suppress certain kinds of answers and elevate other kinds of answers. Musk seems to be doing this with Grok on a personal level, but the Trump administration has proposed that substantially all large AI models be prevented from offering woke answers, because they can define woke to mean anything they like. It can be any amount of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, representation, bias that they want to build in. So we could ironically be accelerating the globalization of AI just by making Americans not able to do that round trip inside our own country.
One of the things, I think there's a bunch of different directions you could go with that, but like one of the things that I've been wondering about a lot is some of, especially what you were talking about, but across the board, some of the concerns are, it gets back to the question of who controls that particular tool, and whether or not you have agency over those tools. And there's all the discussions about like open source models or small models that you could run locally, or things of that nature that maybe help get around that. But one of the things that I've noticed lately is also that I tend to play around with multiple models, and often will run the same query on multiple models and get very, very different answers. And I find that to be really powerful. And I actually like the fact that I use a tool that lets me, just plug in whichever model I want and then sort of play around and see what answers come back. But, I don't think most people do that. I think, once again, I'm weird. Wonderful. I keep asking the people who make the tool that I use to build in a panel feature, where I want to be able to ask it a question and have multiple AIs sort of argue over the answer for me. But I'm wondering, like, are there other things like that will help get people out of sort of just being in a particular bubble or a particular zone that then becomes a target for control?
I mean, I have a different, maybe this is a controversial view, what political economy AI should have. I don't think a future of like, an oligopoly of frontier models is really desirable. I mean, I see a future where we have as many AIs as the diversity and multiplicity of our relationships, and agents representing those coalitions and groups, whether those be companies or those be faith groups. And
How do you get there? I mean, I agree that's a great thing, but how do you get there?
well, there's an incentive compatibility issue to deal with to make sure these agents are actually responsive to their principles, and we can talk a little bit about that. And really the price of attention and cost of influence, which is the title of my last paper, and how do you influence agents, right, and how agents act on your behalf. I think there's a fundamental tension between money and voting, and you can actually resolve, and you can think about money as buying attention and voting as influence. And if you take my theory of power, which is power is information and control, forcing a bifurcation and a trade-off between whether you want more information or you want more control, and adopting both aspects, the things that we like about money and the things we like about voting, and discarding their weaknesses, is a kind of mechanism, but probably one of many that we can experiment with to have incentive compatible agents. But having a broader political economy of many AIs interoperating, negotiating, so there is no one winner take all, or I think we can do better than oligopoly, and we should do better than oligopoly because that's unstable. And also maybe trends towards geographical oligopoly, which we don't want from Panama to Greenland. So, how do we get there? I think there's experiments that we can do. One of the big mistakes I think that we're making in the political economy of AI is how we treat data. I mean, these frontier models rely on data and compute, and no surprise, there's a race to hoover up as much data controlled by the government, and leverage sovereign debt markets and integrate with the government to buy as much compute. And that's the accelerationist race we face right now. But of course, that's the political economy of like a Venezuelan oil, economy, where participants do not get rewarded for their data contributions, and instead have to end up in a situation where we get doled out a UBI, right? And that's undesirable. So creating actually two-sided marketplaces that recognize data as something that is socially generated in groups, in conversations between people, that enables them to govern the uses and abuses of that data, and at the same time trade off of the value of that as a coalition, whether it be a Hollywood Actors Guild or whether it be a music guild, or any kind of coalition, is the way that the fundamental, so Anthropic cannot hoover up our data inputs, but actually has to pay for them, right, and negotiate their value. And not rely on authoritarian funding sources from Saudi Arabia to subsidize that. Changing that political economy, and looking at data as not something that is a public good, right, and not something that is a private good, but something in between, and modeling it as the economic good that it is, as an input, can actually achieve the best of both markets and democracy, and encourage this plurality.
Kramer, you're about to say something?
Yeah, I want to be a little more, much more pessimistic than Saffron about the civic engagement stuff, because I think the civic engagement problem runs into the same problem as the democracy problem as a whole, and also runs into the people don't want two answers from two different AIs problem, which is everybody went to graduate school thinks of graduate school mentality as being a kind of low energy state, that people are constantly seeking new information. They're constantly willing to play off conflicting goals. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. People want, and I say this as somebody who at NYU has to fight the fact that ChatGPT, less than 1,000 days old, is now treated as an authority figure among students. If I could just get students to use two tools, we would be further ahead than where we are. But in fact, the consensus around ChatGPT is not just an accident of its first launch in this particular interaction paradigm. It's the fact that, as also happened to Google, people want there to be a consensus generator that's not that. And I am afraid, to your point, your experiment about if we put it together, we have to think through these issues. They gain information and clarity and thoughtfulness in one direction or another, whether they're using AI or they're using Google. But there's a sort of popcorn effect about that experiment, which is you told the people, we're paying attention to you, but we want you to help you think through these. the attention to the release they were paying, you know, busy work, my kids are stressing me out, whatever. That is the normal case. So I don't think we can, this gets back to one of your original questions. I don't think we can posit a natural human force that leads us towards engaged pluralism. I think every place that that's put in place, it's put in place because people who are thinking long-term like the downstream effects of pluralism more than they like the alternatives. But I mean, it's this weird thing. A lot of democracy starts with the kind of undemocratic movement by a small group to say we're going to do things differently, and then you try to create positive norms. And so, on both the supply side and the demand side with AI right now, we're really challenged because neither the federal government nor the major US AI firms have much incentive to push us in the direction forward.
I think we have some time for audience questions. We have a lot of questions, apparently. We probably don't have time for all of those, but I will say, in the interest, since there are so many questions, if we can do them where they are an actual question and they are relatively quick, as in 1 or 2 sentences, and hopefully directed at an actual person, then we can go from there. Do we have another microphone, or can people just yell out, or no?
Use this one, I'll just tell you.
Okay.
So I'll just be quick. I mean, this whole time I'm just thinking about who wrote Project 2025 and how it seemed to me it was kind of old school, heritage, you know, all the think tanks. There were, as far as I understand, there was no AI use of like, what did MAGA think about the Department of Transportation, correct? This is like a small group that wrote Project 2025. Okay, my point being that I really like this idea of the vision of liberalism using AI to democratize communities. And I think these models, we shouldn't undersell them. I think we should expand, you know, what was it, Engage California? There should be Engage Texas right now with the redistricting issue.
So
there's just so much that's touching AI. I just want your comment about that. Like, is the long-term plan in terms of a point we've all talked about, we need our own 2025, you know, how do you center AI into that, a bigger agenda?
Anyone?
I'll just say that I would be surprised if people on Project 2025 did not use AI. Right now, it is a tool that's drawn into repeat writing from a blank page. Even if they just started with something they didn't like and edited their way out of it, very often AI is in the background. So I wouldn't be comfortable saying we're sure that this was produced without it. But I will say that as we move towards things, you know, Google's Notebook LM is, I think, a particularly good example of document-centric rather than conversation-centric tools. We can start to say, this group has some principles they care about, or this group has some goals we're trying to articulate. I think at least one way to go in the direction you're pushing to is to have civic groups who are using these tools talk about the use of the tools separate from their goals, right? Which documents did you put together? How did you share the output? Google is constantly hearing from us. NYU happens to be a Google shop. They're constantly hearing from us. We want more sharing. We want the ability to export things. We want the ability to say, here's a document store for a whole department, not just for an individual professor, et cetera, et cetera. And Google, as is always the case, shipped for individuals, and now they're backfilling on group orientation. But where groups use AI, if they could share practices around sharing documents and having that help them coordinate, including coordinating conversations about their disagreements. That would be a civic layer we could build right now without waiting for new capabilities in the tools.
My question will be very quick. So in my conception of humans, we are both smart and lazy. And I mean that in the least offensive way possible. Now, we don't want to exert too much energy, right? I'm wondering how, and maybe I'll direct this towards you, Clay, since you're at NYU and interacting with students, like how can we optimize our use of AI so that it makes us smarter but not lazier? As I think social media has made us intellectually lazy with one another in many ways that have been very negative.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say sort of one of our mottos is AI to connect people, not to replace people. The problem we've got with students is even if you give them good uses, you're not taking away the potentially bad ones. So we're actually in the middle of a kind of medieval turn towards blue books and oral exams, and the more directed, like if I want to know what you no, I'm not going to look at your paper anymore because writing the noun has been decoupled from writing the verb. So I have to talk to you and find out what's in your head. But I think that kind of engagement is probably going to be true. You know, the maximum case of this is humans huddling together for warmth while most content, no, seriously, most content in the world be produced by machines. And we will only know we're talking to each other if we have a shibboleth of some sort. But I do think that kind of human-to-human connection is where assessment is going, because production has been decoupled from thinking.
Clay, do the students know how to use a pen?
No, so this is the group that didn't learn cursive, and now like this is a blue book. It's really a problem. Yeah, right. We need typewriters. Yes, all of that. This whole AI has been engineered by big typewriters.
Yeah. Okay. This question is for Saffron. Basically, industry standards are not cutting it for ensuring pro-social behavior from AI companies. It seems like regulation is necessary. Anthropic is basically the only company that I'm calling like relatively ethical in the AI space. But the stance on the California AI bill was pretty weak, and congressional testimony has been like, we don't want to be regulated. What is Anthropic doing to try to ensure good AI regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so there's like a whole policy team that works on kind of engaging with regulators and talking to them and all of these things. And I'm not as involved with that like on the ground work, but I think, you know, there is a lot of advocacy for regulation and kind of against things like, you know, let's pause regulation for 10 years kind of deal. Yeah, I'm not an expert on like the actual talking with people and how that turns out kind of thing. I think the thing that my team does and that I can do is I'm on the societal impacts team, and we basically are just trying to like do as much empirical research as possible on like how AI is impacting people in various ways and publishing that into the world, so that to sort of like inform regulation or and just help people make informed decisions. So publishing stuff on like emotional impacts, like are people using Claude as therapists or falling in love with it or whatever. And that's out there. It's on the blog. There's stuff on like education, and like yes, there's a percentage of students using it for cheating, and we document that and what that looks like. And like the economic index, which is sort of like running kind of doing like longitudinal data collection, privacy preserving data collection on like how are people using AI for economically relevant tasks and in what industries. So, I mean, I think like the work that I do and my team is just like one of the good ways to try and be pro-social is like putting information out there. What was the thing I was going to say? I think it's also because, you know, there's such a huge debate about AI and there are people on both sides of it, you know, it's like great, it's terrible, it's whatever. And one of the more useful things we can do as like researchers and sort of data scientists is just like try and make that more concrete instead of entirely speculative. And then, you know, also doing things that are like the collective constitutional AI thing that I was talking about of like, how do we get more democratic input into these decisions? I mean, all of this work takes time, but yeah, I don't know. It's not necessarily transforming.
I started working using ChatGPT a couple of years ago. It blew my mind, and then it was extraordinary productive output. I'm looking at a very deep inquiry and very narrow subject matter. So now it goes back for months. And it really knows. I can tell that it's not only learning the end, it's learning the deep. And so there's two things I wondered about. One is this going to pull us deeper into these kind of news bubbles and pockets that the way the social media is fat enough that it's pulling me in deeper? And then it's basically, the next thing I'm wondering is when is it going to stay close to out of bay doors now, and because I mean, it's not smarter than me, but it can, it's a lot faster and it can go a lot wider. And do you know when to tell it no? Well, when I tell it to now, it's going to sound a little mechanical, but I tell it, give me the pros and the cons and the, this is something I've been wondering. When people are using it, how often do they push back? I find it easier to push back on than if I'm having a conversation. It's true, but it's bullshit. When it's telling me what I want to hear, so I asked me before, and I think it's really dangerous because it's very seductive to be told you're so smart and good looking. I swear to God, you're the best guy in this field. So you have to feel it doing that.
The times you think it's bullshitting, but there's also times it's bullshitting that you don't detect. It's the false positives that are the risk there.
That's the one I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, right. So we are already in a world where there are a number of well-documented cases of people having psychotic breaks by being in conversation with these tools. And this is the hardest thing to think through. If somebody is startled by the reflection in the mirror and punches the mirror, you'd know what to do about their bloody fingers. You would say, like, that was really dumb. But when these tools are designed to present as if they're personalities, it's very difficult to say what the agency is. For somebody who has a psychotic break talking to the tool, you could say, you just punched a mirror. Why did you do that? But in fact, right, there's all this language like glazing. Glazing was originally done to describe the output of the text. We're the ones being glazed. Right? We're the donuts. And this thing is in this, like, it applies that stuff to us, and because the metaphor of you're acting with another intelligence is so powerful, the thing I worry about, Mike, is less, do you know when it's wrong, than do you remember that it's not thinking? Because that's the hard thing to remember, because the interaction pattern is close enough. We've never had anything that felt like thinking when you're interacting.
This has gotten more difficult to discern as they've gotten better at NLP. Now, it's the language is really, really conversational.
Let's move on to the next question. We're running out of time.
Hi, Kelly Bourne. I used to direct the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford, and I now lead a democracy program. Saffron, nice to see you, Mike, too. And my question is about power, because I want to come back to Saffron, the point that you made, because I love all of these ideas of civic tools and ways for engagement. I spent a lot of time in the deliberative democracy space. The problem was always when these are just technical alternatives or augmentations to that government wouldn't adopt it, no matter what we did. And we did some really specific and interesting things, I think. And so ultimately, to use any of these for good requires some public power to do so. So when you mentioned that you're not a fan of windfall or UBI, and I see the challenges with that. I'm curious what you think about data dividends or universal basic capital as an alternative, or some way to ensure that all these benefits can be democratically realized by first ensuring that there's some economic and political power still distributed in our society.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for your question. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the no piece that we're referring to at the start of this discussion is basically a UBC argument, I would say, but like UBC or universal basic capital in a way that is geared towards being able to take advantage of AI and like the economic kind of like value that it can create. I think all of the like stuff around data dividends and all of these things are cool. I feel like they're not as pragmatic, or like people, or it's been hard to get them to work from all the people I've talked to and the things that I've seen. And so I think there's maybe a way that like people can think of, creating this in the right shape to really have it take off.
There's a way. I mean, like, I don't understand why we're like agreeing to this like Venezuelan will, where we just hoover up data and don't pay for it. Like, I don't understand. Like, so, your question is about power, right? So my house is high context. You walk into my house, you see what's hanging, you see the food, you can learn a lot about me. You go into my neighborhood, you know a little less about me, right? But if I have strict access controls on my house, I have less access controls on my neighborhood, right? And we have proximity, right? Why don't we represent those privacy expectations also in our conversations and AI agents that like represent and like are participating in those conversations and communicating with other communities and negotiating value, right? Like, why can't we open a new political economy around inputs into these models and reward contributions, right? And index that, right, based off of your access to like information control.